According to history, it was believed that the land known as New England was already being lived in by the Native Americans before the arrival of the Europeans. People living in the area spoke the Algonquian language, but when the Europeans arrived, everything changed. Described as one of the greatest wars in American history, King Philip's War, also known as the Great Indian War, was fought between 1675 and 1676. Termed one of the bloodiest wars in the history of the United States, the war was actually between Native Americans and British settlers, aided by their Indian allies. Amidst this historical turmoil, one can't help but wonder, how did the clash between Native Americans and British settlers shape the course of New England's history, leaving an indelible mark on the land and its people? Stay tuned as we tell the story in detail. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on your notification bell. New England, in the northeast of today's United States of America, existed before the advent of the Europeans, who came in and named the town after their home country. Historians put the number of residents living in the area at about 70,000 to 100,000 American natives before the 17th century. The indigent of today's New England was a part of the Algonquian natives, who shared some language similarities and cultural affiliations with many other groups, including the Abenaki, Pennacook, Micmac, Moheganset, Nauset, Warinoko, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. In the south of New England, some groups lived in small villages where the women farmed the fields and sow beans and corn. The men in the villages were mostly fishermen and hunters. Also, the women and their children gathered berries and nuts from the abundant forests. While in the north, the climate was not good enough for sowing seeds, the Native Americans that inhabited the lands were dependent on hunting and gathering fruits and nuts for food, as well as trading them. The start of the 17th century witnessed the trade between Native Americans and European merchants, who mostly exchanged beaver pelts for textiles and metal. Unfortunately, some Europeans also brought some strange diseases that were not peculiar to the natives. Because of these differences, catastrophic diseases struck, and the result was terrible. In 16, an epidemic brought by the Europeans spread and caused the deaths of 75% of the natives on the Atlantic coast. After the whole incident, things started to unfold. Most of the natives in the villages of New England were partly settled. This is because when the land started lacking nutrients, many, if not most, moved to a nearby area to allow the bush to follow. They did not know land ownership. They only wanted to live. Soon, the Europeans started to penetrate their lands, forming different settlements. The early European settlers were pilgrims who first arrived from England to stay in Plymouth in the early winter of 1620. History has it that the site they settled was the Pawtuxet village, which was completely wiped out by the strange disease contracted by the Europeans. History also says that one of the Portuguese, Squanto, was kidnapped and taken to England by one of the European captains, but later fled and luckily returned to his homeland in America. He met with the European pilgrims at home and taught them how to do many things, like planting corn and where and how to fish in the waters. Squanto also helped as a translator among the American natives and the Englishmen, especially in negotiations for peace with the village chiefs. Unfortunately, the peace never lasted. The next few decades were eroded by conflicts between the foreigners and the Native Americans. What transpired was that the English settlers started laying claims to the land where they had lived, farmed, hunted, and fished. What further worsened the situation was the trade competition, which destabilized the entire New England. The Peugeot War started, and thousands were killed and several villages destroyed in an 8-month war that started in 1637 and ended the subsequent year. Fast forward to 1675, a new calamity that wreaked havoc in the region began to set flames, waiting for the fire. One of the chiefs, whose name was named after, rose to defend the people. He tried to use all his might to defend the people and preserve their honor, but his plans went south, and further calamity soon struck. The early historians of the 18th century have always relied on the information from Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay to describe bloody wars that cannot be forgotten in the history of America. The accounts from these colonies called it King Philip's War. Philip, known as Metacom Sachem, meaning Chief Philip in English, was the chief of the Wampanoag tribe of Native America and was born by Massasoit, who welcomed the first colonists to arrive in New England in Plymouth in 1621. Due to the huge role the Narragansett, who were the largest group in the south of New England, played in the war, a few historians called the war the Great Narragansett War. But what transpired? Was there a bloody war? It all started when the Plymouth colony executed 3 of King Philip's men in 1675. The warriors were tried, and it turns out they were guilty of the murder of John Sassamon. John Sassamon was an Indian schooled at Harvard, who became a Puritan and served as an interpreter for the British and the Wampanoag people. He was also one of Philip's advisors, but was accused of spying for the British colonists. Sassamon's murder came with a lot of tensions that drew the battle line between the native Indians and British colonists, who had been resenting the colonists for over 55 years. It all started over a land dispute and claims that were against the rearing of livestock, as well as fishing and hunting land used by the colonialists. Other things that grew the beef were interracial hatred and the cultural intrusion of the English on the natives. The conversion of Indians to British Christianity and the style of the economy further fueled the fire between the two. The following few months witnessed the range of the Native Americans and the colonist militia, which spanned the current-day Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine. Even though the Narragansetts were never interested in the war and wanted to stay neutral, a few of their warriors operated in secret, raiding the many colonial locations and killing many of their militias. Not long after, the truth was revealed, and it was found that the Narragansetts were not as neutral as they claimed, but were clandestinely fighting their colonialists in secret, despite all the peace treaties both parties had signed. This instigated the war more and prompted the colonies of Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut to assemble the largest colonial militias in the history of New England, which consisted of over 1,000 men together, with over 100 Indian allies. The end of 1675 saw the marshalling of the colonial attacks on Rhode Island, led by Josiah Winslow, the governor of the Plymouth colony. The aim was targeted at the Narragansetts before they could cause them more problems. Empty villages were razed down completely. On a cold, snowy morning in December of the same year, the colonist militia and their Indian betrayer, allies, stormed the main fortress of Narragansett, located on the swampy island currently known as West Kingston, Rhode Island. The battle is known as the Great Swamp Fight. On the eve of the day, the colonist militia had already defeated the Narragansetts and began to burn down the village and the food supply. The number of casualties was not actually in the book, but looking at the size of the village, historians suggested that more than 150 villagers were killed that very day, which mostly consisted of children, women, and elderly adults who were either massacred by knives, bullets, or burned to death. Despite the loss to the colonists, a few were said to have escaped, some of whom later died due to overexposure to the mud. On the flip side, the militia did not have it all smooth, as casualties on their side were just a little lower, numbering about 70 killed and 130 wounded, out of which a significant number never survived the injuries. The next morning of the attack, looking at the casualties recorded and the damage recovered by the colonists, caused the other Narragansetts to join the war against the English in the troubled region. Going back to King Philip, he had wanted all other neighboring natives to join him in the bloody war. But when the Mohawks joined forces with the English and attacked, all his hopes were shattered, and it created some bad blood between many Indian natives. The British colonists thought the great swamp fight would instill fear and end the all-edged treason by the Indians, but it didn't. In fact, it all just started. Unfortunately for the colonial militia, many Indians formed alliances under the leadership of Narragansett, Sachem, and Canonchet, and attacked aggressively. The attack gave the militias a run for their lives and made most of the militias around Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island forcefully retreat. This time, a huge damage was done to the whites by the supposed weak side. The Narragansetts destroyed and brought down all the abodes of the whites on Rhodes Island, especially on the western side, and even Providence, which was later razed down on March 16, 1676. At last, the natives on Rhodes Island were defeated, and most of the colonies were opened to white people. Connecticut was claimed by the South as a reward for defeating the Narragansett. And in the late spring of 1676, most other colonies started following the lead of Connecticut by instigating Indians. What they did was befriend some Indians and make them join their forces. Benjamin Church, under Plymouth's command, which was a non-Connecticut exception, used the Indian allies right from the start of the bloody war, and he succeeded and used them against Philip. King Philip was murdered in August of 1676, and in September they attacked the Native Americans, who were in opposition in the south of New England, killed them in their thousands, and sold so many as slaves and servitude. Similarly, the attackers were not left unscathed. Over 600 soldiers also met their Waterloo, and not less than 17 of the white soldiers were brought down in the war. Additionally, about 50 more white settlements also suffered some significant destruction. Connecticut was the only place that was untouched due to its special relationship with the Native Americans. Briefly, let's talk about what happened in the Northern Theater in Acadia and Maine. Right before the war started, the English people settled in Maine. They have always been at peace, living in Maine and New Hampshire with their neighbors, the Wampanoags. The English settlers were into fishing, harvesting wood, and trading with the natives, and in 1657, the settlement of the English started expanding down to the Kennebec rivers. Soon, events started unfold. When the Wampanoag attacked Swansea, the colonists in York assembled around the Kennebec River in June of 1675 and commanded the Wabanakis to surrender their guns and war equipment to prove they were at peace with them. But the request was turned down and started raiding the settlements of the colonists. They decimated the settlement of the English men on the east side of the Saco River under the command of their leaders, Androscoggin Sagamore Mogegan and Penobscot Sagamore Mordocawando. The three brutal attacks by these Indian natives triggered the colonists and resulted in a deadly response by the colonists. Charles Frost and Richard Waldron led the colonial militias around the north, and Charles sent forces to attack Acadia. The other half of the troops, led by Mogegan, simultaneously attacked towns like Wells, Damariscove, and built a flotilla of about 40 sloops and 30-ton ships. The fishing practice of the Maines was destroyed by the flotilla of the Wabanaki. History from Salem has it that 20 sketches were stolen and destroyed in a single attack in Maine. Later on, in 1677, the Wabanaki soon sued for peace, and the war in the region ended and peace was returned to Maine after both parties signed what is known as the Treaty of Casco in 1678. The agreement allowed settlers to return, but on the condition that every family of the British settlers must pay them a peck of corn every year. After the war ended, It was recorded that about 400 English settlers lost their lives and the fishing practice in the Maines was destroyed. But the natives still maintained their powers in the north and east of Maine. The figures for the number of deaths recorded by the natives were not accurate, but it was put at about 100 to 300. Fast forward to after the war, when the expansionist agenda of the colonists continued, they started invading and capturing more Native American settlements. The act led to more and more conflicts, which claimed the lives of many natives. Soon they started to colonize almost all the Native American settlements, imposing on them their laws, which sparked a series of protests and built hatred for the colonists among the Native Americans. When King Philip died, the war in the south of England died too, and momentary peace returned. But by then, over 1,000 colonists were said to have died, and more than 3,000 natives also lost their lives. Not less than half of the villages and towns in New England were destroyed by the warriors of the Native Americans and English militias. Hundreds of native people were sold as slaves, especially women and children, including King Philip's son, of which were sold off to slave camps in Barbados, Jamaica, Spain, Madeira, Portugal, and many other slave markets. The Wampanoags, Narragansetts, Nimiuk, and Podunk were said to have suffered the biggest hits of the war. Some factions among these tribes were annihilated by the English colonists after being captured. Plymouth Colony lost a significant percentage of its adult males and a lesser population of adult females. The indigenous suffered some major ill losses. More than 2,000 men were killed, and over 3,000 tribesmen and women were said to have died of hunger and starvation. The north of New England, on the other hand, never saw peace immediately after the Malcolm War. In fact, it witnessed about 6 wars in 74 years, of which many were between New France and New England. It prompted most of the colonists to move to areas in Massachusetts to protect them, and to New Hampshire to avoid being attacked by the Wampanoag. As time went by, more of the effects of King Philip's War started to unfold, and behold, the colonial government was developed. To avert and prevent what happened during the King Philip War and other minor conflicts, they built a very strong militia capable of containing any conflict that may arise. And in a few years, the system of democracy was introduced to the different colonies. As bloody as the war seems, it brought both good and evil to the Native Americans. Representative democracy made a significant mark on the development and enabled the natives to also air their voices. Naming others benefited from the bloody war that claimed tens of thousands of lives. It helped to create mutual relationships between the British military government and the colonists. The colonists saw their victory in the war as a statement and testimony to their strength and ability to defend themselves from attacks by the natives. These and many other events caused the American Revolution and the independence of the United States as a country. When we talk about the after effects of King Philip's War on religion, Christianity prevailed. However, some of the colonists perceived the aggression of the Native Americans as having hatred for their faith, which is why a few English historians describe it as the Holy War. And when it was over, the sentiment towards natives who refused to accept the faith grew, particularly among those regarded as Puritans. Other aftermaths include the rise of the slave trade in the different colonies. Demand for labor went up, so to meet the demands, most of the white colonists had to become slavers, buying slaves to work in their field. Consequently, this resulted in the creation of slave societies in almost all the colonies, especially in the south of New England. On the economy, the war had some impacts as well. The British government decided to impose taxes and duties on the colonies for war expenses, which also caused a bit of misunderstanding among the colonists. Trade routes were also disrupted, leading to a shortage of food supplies. The economy was so severely jeopardized that it had to start from scratch all over again. The culture of the American natives was one of the things that were greatly impacted too. It impacted the development of the literary industry in the Americas. Great writers like Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin wrote about the several impacts of the Philip War on the literature of America. What it did was create a unique literary writing technique that is now often characterized by titles and themes of independence, democracy, and freedom. Beyond its positive impact, it caused many future unrests and mishaps in North America. Those impacts, economic issues, the slave trade, and many more, are what aggravated and led to the American Revolution. But fortunately, they birthed the United States of America. The King Philip War can be described in a sentence as a land dispute between natives and foreigners. Yet, it is a history that can never be written off in the 1,000 years to come. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed watching the video, give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notifications so you get alerts each time we post new informative and educational videos like this. See you in our next video.